You are live. We are live. Hello, everybody. I am Bill, the company's expert, and I'm here with Abby from Life Work Balance, trying something new. We're going to talk about tell me about yourself, the job interview question. We're going to discuss what's the best way to answer, what are some options, and I think we're just going to do a general conversation about this question and job interviews and all of that. So, welcome to Abby. It's good to see you again.
Hi, Bill. Great to see you. I'm
Yeah.
really excited to chat with you about this question today. I did a little bit of promotion of it on my channel, so we'll see how much interaction we get. But
Right
I
on.
watched your video on how to answer the question, tell me about yourself, before we had our time today. And it's very different from the way that I suggest that we answer this question. So I think it's a really good combination of different opinions on how to answer this question and different strategies and techniques. So I think it'll be a great experience for everyone
Definitely.
who's watching.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's such a general question. To be honest with you, I actually hate this question. I think it's so general. And I mean, I don't know if you've ever been in a conversation with like just a friend or something, you're talking, people don't talk like this. People don't say, so tell me about yourself. It's just a very artificial, formal kind of way to talk. It's like the opposite of a free flowing, two-way conversation. It's very formal. And I think what intimidates people is just, at least for me, it's how general it is. I mean, you could say literally anything, and it would technically be an answer to this question. I think a lot of people have a lot of fear of like what are they asking me? Like, what do they want to know? I have no idea where to start.
Yes, and we can really be our own worst enemies when we answer this question, because tell me about yourself could mean tell me where you grew up and if you're married and if how old you are, which are really discriminatory questions and answers.
Yes.
So we can get ourselves in trouble if we don't have a little bit of strategy around it. And at the same time, like you just said, it's not very conversational. I'm not going to go up to one of my really good friends and say, tell me about yourself, and expect a perfect interview answer. So it's a great way to set us up for a lot of anxiety and stress and concerns when it comes to the overall interview process, which is already lots of anxiety, stressing.
I was going to say that's like pretty much the theme of a lot of job interviews. You're not comfortable. You're probably feeling like we were talking about this a moment ago, just before the stream began. It's like, right when you're between jobs or you're looking for another job, already you feel probably like your self-esteem, your self-confidence is about the lowest it's going to be, at pretty much almost any point in your life, in terms of believing in yourself and feeling confident about the future. And then you go to a job interview, it's you're outside your comfort zone, you're on somebody else's turf, and then, you're nervous, and then you're especially if there's like a group interview, and you got like four people across the table from you staring you down, and they're all strangers, and so, and then they ask you a question that like, it's almost like a brain tease. It's like, what exactly are you even asking me, let alone what's the right answer,
Yeah, what do you
to
want
that.
from me?
Yeah.
And it's to the Brady Bunch on your screen if it's a virtual interview with that panel, or you're sitting on one end of the table with other people on the other side. It just is a very divisive feeling process.
Yeah, exactly. It's not, there's a lot of problems with it, but, and I got to get this out of the way because somebody always takes me to task on this. Is it a question if it doesn't have a question mark? What's your opinion on that?
I think that questions can be leading, or they can more be just like statements. And so I think from a like technical grammatical standpoint, it's probably not a question if it doesn't have the question mark. And at the same time, maybe we try to make it a little bit more friendly, like just a statement. Tell me about yourself. I'm not starting the interview process yet by asking you a question. Just let's introduce ourselves.
I'm directing you to do something for me. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good start. Okay. So maybe a good place to start would be, why don't you give us your recommendation for how candidates should attack this question, how they should respond to it, what it means, what's your take on it? Maybe let's start with that.
Sure. So I think that your answer to this question really sets the stage for how you start an interview. It is a way to really set yourself up for success or for failure, because it's your first impression during the interview process. And so when we're answering this question, I recommend starting it like a story. So we don't want it to be just a verbal review of your resume, because the person who has already started the interview process likely has looked at your resume and they already know what your past jobs have been, responsibilities, etc. So it's our job to hook the listener and have them really start to get invested in who we are as people and how we can really bring value to this role, this team, and this organization. So I recommend doing so through a 3-part formula, which if anyone on this stream has watched any of my videos, it's one of my most popular videos of how to answer the question, tell me about yourself. And it's the formula of present, past, future. And so I like to break it down that way because it's a little bit easier to remember when you're in the heat of the moment. Present, past, future. I'm going to talk about what I'm doing right now, who I am, what I bring to the table. Then I'm going to talk briefly about my past experience and how it specifically relates to this role. Not necessarily a verbal review of my resume, but specifically touching on the important pieces from my experience that's relevant to the role that I'm applying to. And then the future portion is how I see myself bringing value to the role, the team, the organization, and what I'm excited about for this role. And so when you think about it more as telling a story about who you are, I think that takes a little bit of the pressure off to be like super professional and composed and still be seen as a human. So what about you? What's your take on how to answer this question?
It's, you were talking about earlier how mine kind of contrasted with yours. And I've got a sort of different like general recommendation of how people do it. I think that's quite interesting, actually, the past, present, future thing. That makes a lot of sense in terms of like setting up something. What I traditionally recommend for people is the way I see it is that the problem that a lot of people have when asked this is they don't know where to start. They don't know what, like, should I talk about my ambition? Should I talk about my work history? Should I talk about my accomplishments? Should I talk about, where I went to school and, all this kind of stuff? Or is it a more of a personal thing? Like, is it about my personality type or my preferences or my values? Like, you could go so many different directions. And it seems like you could make an argument for each one of those being at least somewhat relevant to what a recruiter or a hiring manager might be interested in, and what they might want to learn about you to help them make a decision of whether they should select you for this role if it's right for you. Mm-hmm. So my kind of approach was to address that and say, like, well, what should I talk about? And my recommendation was, if you don't know like which of these directions you should branch out into, start with the things that they mentioned in the job description, where they said, like, we're looking for this and this and this and this. So the assumption is that, okay, if that's accurate, if they did indeed write down the things that they are in fact looking for, and these are the main things they care about, let's start with those. And then we can maybe go outward from there. So my recommendation was, when someone says to you, tell me about yourself, as a memory jog, it sometimes helps to have these little lines and mnemonics in your head. This isn't a mnemonic technically, but it's something you can remember. You say with, well, as you can see from my resume. Now that's kind of optional, and if you say that in the wrong way, it can come across maybe arrogant or whatever. But the point is, it's more of a memory jog for you to, like, okay, I'm gonna talk about the things that are on my resume, and I'm gonna specifically talk about the things that they said that they were looking for. So my recommendation is you start off with that one line, as you can see from my resume, and then you do a summary of your resume in like 45 seconds, like just a very brief summary. I went to school here. I worked in this role at this company for 2 years, and I moved here, and I currently work in this role at this other company in this role. And that's like sort of the starting point. And then to conclude it, you could use the phrase, and that's what brings me here today, and why I'm interested in learning more about this opportunity. Because the reasoning there is that people don't really care about what you did 5 years ago at some other company and like all the details. They want to know, are you right for this role? That's what you're here to talk about, this role. And so if you're given an open-ended question, you could talk about anything. You could talk about your brother. You could talk about your favorite pet. You could go in any direction. Let's talk about how you relate to this role and get them to start to see you as the person that would fit here and that, has all the qualifications and all that kind of stuff. So that was, in a nutshell, my general approach to how to answer this.
And I think one of the great kind of commonalities between these two different ways of answering this question is that we're really tailoring it to the job that we're applying to. So You can answer it using my formula of present, past, future, Or you could answer it with your format where you say, base what you've seen on my resume, and then kind of go through those relevant details from your past experience. And then this is what brings me here today. The common theme is that you need to tailor your answer to the job that you're applying to and to the person that you're interviewing with. Because the
Exactly.
other thing is that if I'm interviewing with a recruiter during a phone screening or the very first interview, my answer to tell me about yourself might be slightly different with a recruiter than with a hiring manager. The hiring manager might be way more technical and know a lot of more of the details of the work, whereas the recruiter might be someone from HR who's just making sure that this person has the basic qualifications. So,
definitely. Like, this is the thing. I mean, it's so general. And like, okay, the problem is with something like this, it's hard to give a blanket answer to, people that, like, you're being hired, you're interviewing for like a vice president role somewhere, as opposed to someone who's interviewing for a minimum wage entry level job somewhere else, or someone who's talking to a recruiter, and they ask this question at the beginning of the first interview, or you're answering this question if it's asked to you by a CEO or a board member, and this is the fourth interview you've done. I mean, it's so varied. Like, so there's not going to be one, single answer that will work for everybody in every situation. And to complicate matters, this isn't even like a very specific question. You could talk about other standard interview questions like, where do you see yourself in 5 years or something like, and at least it's a more clearly defined question. This is not even a very clearly defined question. You could translate it as just start talking to me, almost. Yeah. That's almost the vibe that you get from this. And so it's so hard to pin down, and there's going to be a different response that will be more appropriate in different situations. So that's why it's also interesting how so many people recommend so many different answers to this. Mm-hmm. And I think it's based on where we're all coming from and what our experiences have been. So yeah, that's the interesting thing about it,
Yeah. Well, and I could be asked this question at a networking event with people that I don't know, that I'm not really truly interviewing with, but I still want to give them a pitch about who I am and what I do and why it's relevant to them. Or with the final interview with someone that I may have already interviewed with a couple of times. So it can really trip us up. And I think getting personal into some personal details is a little bit scary, and at the same time could also work to our benefit. If I'm going to be doing a little bit of research on the person that I'm interviewing with ahead of time, and I learn that they are big fans of the same sports team that I'm a big fan of.
Yeah.
Even that might be an interesting thing to drop into the answer, just to see if you can build some rapport with that person.
Oh, totally. I mean,
it can be really scary to do that.
That's a great point. Like, if you will have also different goals. Like, one person would have a goal of like, okay, I want to start speaking to the things that they said they were looking for, so that I know that when I walk out of this room, I communicated to them that I do have all the things that they said they were looking for. Because sometimes if we just go into a fun, free-flowing conversation about sports or whatever, we never get back to addressing some of these central, more obvious issues. And then you walk out of the room and you're thinking like, oh, I never even mentioned any of the consulting work I do, or I didn't talk about this job or this thing I did outside of work that I think would be a total, like, bonus for them to know about, or I didn't mention my volunteering work, which would have like totally tied in with what they said they were, so, but then you make a great point. It's like, okay, if your goal is to, establish rapport, and you want to, for you, that's priority one right from the outset. You're going to focus on that, and that might mean going off into talking about sports or whatever. If the recruiter makes a comment or, whatever, you don't want to just ignore it and then just keep saying your thing, So, right. That's the great thing. Can you see the comments that are coming in StreamYard?
I see a couple of comments come through. I see 3 total.
So I want to do a shout out to Antonio Lopez, who's here. Antonio says, been looking forward to this one. So right on, Antonio. Your wish has come true. Yes. So this is your lucky day. And I'm terrible with names. I always bastardize everybody's names, and it's no disrespect intended. But I'm going to try this. Droshianos says, this crossover is wild. Thank you, guys.
Yep. I see those same comments. It's great to see everyone here.
Right on. Yeah. You're welcome, Droshianos. And it's your lucky day too. And thank you for being here and checking us out. But yeah, so coming back to that, like, sorry, I think I cut you off. Actually, you were about to say something, and then I went to the comments.
Yeah, well, I think one of the just a rule to stick to when it comes to answering this question is keep it professional. If you are going to make that leap to try to, bring in something personal, maybe I noticed something in the background of someone's video, like a flag that I recognize or an action figure of some sort, then that might be a time to towards the end make that type of comment, or if I can work it in somewhere that would work. But I think in general, the best rule to follow is let's try to keep it as professional as possible. We want to make it conversational as well. We don't want it to be a very transactional conversation that doesn't feel very enjoyable for either party. Having it be a little bit more conversational and free flowing and not feel as high stakes can ultimately work well for all the parties involved. But
Yeah, definitely.
if you're worried about it, keep it professional.
Yes, yes, I agree. And the other thing is, like, in different industries, there's different sort of norms for how you conduct a job interview, and you're going to encounter you're probably going to encounter the same issues interview after interview. So, for example, we were talking about establishing a rapport, right? Now, maybe in certain circles, in a certain industry or a certain level, certain geographic region, um, they have very rigid formal job interviews. So the structure generally is that, they ask very formalized questions. It's all on a sheet somewhere. You got to ask the same questions every interview. Very mechanical, not a lot of room for having a free flowing discussion that sort of goes somewhere else. um, and the concern that a candidate might have is, you know I don't really get an opportunity to speak freely. I feel that I could tell them about things that, they may not necessarily ask about on their own accord, but it's relevant, and I want them to know certain things that I can bring to the table. So I want to try and get that in somewhere, and it's very hard to do that with these very rigid formal interviews where they don't give you an opportunity to speak freely. It's just sort of, it's very formal. So in that case, my point is you could use a question like, tell me about yourself, for that purpose, to get these little points in. Um, but in other circles, like mainly kind of, I think I got the vibe from what you were saying, is like, it might not be super formal. There might be plenty of opportunity to speak freely later on, in which case you don't necessarily have to do that stuff I mentioned in the first question. You could do the rapport and the background and all kinds of other things.
Yeah.
So it really depends on the situation you're in too, and like what the norms are.
Yes. Well, and I know at least in the United States, I'm in
Mm,
Colorado, and they're starting to establish some laws that
mm,
are requiring a more consistent, competitive, and equitable process. And
mm.
so, for the companies that I've worked with, we have had an established list of interview questions that has to be asked to each candidate to ensure that each candidate has the same opportunity within that interview. That also doesn't mean that it has to be cold, robotic, and transactional. So I could still have a very different experience asking the same questions to one candidate than I do with a different candidate. And so even if it is a very formalized process and we have to document answers to interview questions and submit interview notes and ensure that there's no discrimination happening, all with that going on, we can still have be a relatively friendly conversation, because at least from a recruiter's perspective and HR's perspective, I like to think of it as a win-win. We're trying to have a win for the candidate to get a job that they really enjoy, that's a good fit for them, that matches compensation needs, and a win for the organization of finding the right person for the right job, so that we can have all these values and outcomes that benefit both parties.
Yeah, yeah. I know there's a lot of good recruiters that do that, and some are quite adept at doing it. Actually, they do this. They conform to these sort of constraints they've been put under, and they do it in a very professional way, and it seems to be done correctly. Um, in my career, sort of, and I'm mainly drawing from experiences I've done like over 10 years ago. These are all like kind of distant memories for me, when I was in my 20s and 30s and stuff. And it's like, my memory was that I went to a lot of interviews, and for whatever reason, uh, people, they wouldn't sort of, they would go through the motions in a very sort of formal way, but it felt like they weren't really upholding the spirit of what the formal constraints were for. So, for example, you're talking about like, being equitable and all this kind of stuff. And, like a classic example to me would be the idea that, you conduct, say, 8 interviews with 8 candidates in the first round, and you keep the questions identical. So you can compare apples to apples. Here's candidate one's response, here's candidate two's response, you know, and I understand the reason behind that. Okay. You want to ask the same questions so that you can compare what everybody's response was. The problem, though, is that it absolutely forces a highly formal, very sometimes unwelcoming dynamic in the interview. It's very robotic. Uh, the candidate doesn't get to speak freely. They don't get asked questions about specifics because these questions have to be applied to everybody. So if you discover a candidate has a certain thing in their past or a certain skill, you can't then ask about that skill because it's not on the form. You have to stick to the very rigid thing. So I find that, in theory, that stuff works, but I've seen a lot of examples where it's not really done very effectively. I don't know what your take is on that whole thing.
Yeah, well, first, I think that it comes down to the interviewer's skill.
Hmm.
And many times, the people who are asked to conduct the interview don't have the skill to recognize when maybe they should ask a follow-up question or a clarifying question. And so what's interesting is that we as candidates are only thinking about our own experience of, asking, questions at the end of the interview. What types of questions should I prepare for? And I think the interviewers don't recognize the type of preparation that should go into preparing to have an interview with a candidate.
Yeah.
Really reading the job description and understanding what type of person we're looking for to fill this, what type of experience we do and don't want. And so that could lead us to a whole different conversation on just skills of interviewers. And I
Yeah.
think that many times it's like whoever's the least busy gets put on the interview panel.
Yep. Yep.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the most equipped to complete an interview and make a decision on who could be joining this team. But considering the cost of empty positions and the cost of like the time to fill a position, we really want to make sure that we're finding people who can actually interview our candidates in the most effective way, which includes being a little bit more conversational, being able to deviate from those really rigid questions, feeling comfortable deviating from those questions, even if we might need to follow a very specific process, because that's where we figure out if people truly are the best fit. If we're just asking these sets of questions and we're getting the same responses, it's going to be really hard to make decisions on who truly is the best fit for a position.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all that. I mean, something else that occurred to me is that like this question, tell me about yourself, which is, kind of the central point here. Mm-hmm. To me, I might be alone in this, but it kind of epitomizes to me some of the practical issues that I know a lot of job seekers have with the whole traditional job interview process, where it's like, when you think about it, if you're qualified for a job, one would think that, okay, you can go down to a job interview. They would ask you questions about your technical skills and all this kind of stuff. And, you wouldn't need preparation to do a job interview per se. You would just have to be qualified to do the job. And then you would pass with flying colors if you were qualified to do the job. Mm-hmm. But instead, you get a situation where a candidate goes down to a job interview. Maybe this is their first, they're an interview for their first career job, maybe out of university or something. Mm-hmm. And the first question they get asked is this, like, tell me about yourself. And then you've got like 4 people like looking at you, and they got their pens at the ready and they're ready to write down notes about what you say next. And it's like, you're thinking like, well, that's not a question about my qualifications or, my experience or, I expected to like, what do people say? They expect to be able to answer questions asked to them specifically about how to do the work. Right.
Yeah.
And this isn't one of those questions. This is like something about you. And I know a lot of introverted people, a lot of technical people like myself, they hate questions like this because it's just like, what, like that's not about what are you asking? And already in the very first line of like the interview, the very first thing somebody says, they're already just thrown right off balance, like just trying to figure out what they're being asked.
Yep.
And then that sets the theme for like the whole interview. They're kind of off, what do you call it? Like off, wrong footed or whatever you call
Yeah.
that.
Off kilter, maybe.
Yeah, there you go. So like, do you think this is if you're in a job interview, do you start with this question? Do you think people should start with this question? Is this the right?
Yeah, well, and I have my opinions about that, but I'd like to know from your perspective of being, a person who does hiring and has experience being the hiring manager and going through a lot of interviews. Why do you think that if we were truly just hiring based off qualifications, why might we start off an interview with this type of question?
Well, I mean, like, okay, here. The way my philosophy for hiring is kind of impractical because I try and sort of follow what you would do to hire like executives and stuff. You go into a lot more detail. It's a lot more labor intensive, and you try to really get to know the person and all. Now, I'm the first to admit that's kind of impractical when you're hiring for people lower down. It just, in terms of efficiency and all the metrics that HR uses in the hiring process, it scores terribly. You can't really do this. It's hard to make a compelling case for doing this, because the reality is that a lot of those jobs at the bottom, they're regarded, rightly or wrongly, they're regarded as being kind of fungible, and like one person's as good as the next as long as you get somebody in there. If this person quits and leaves and it doesn't work out, you just get someone in there and problem solved. You hire someone else, and so it doesn't make sense then to sort of like expend a lot of resources in really trying to select the right person to the nth degree. So after that big disclaimer, this is what I do. I basically have a free-flowing conversation, very similar to an informational interview. And if I'm conducting the interview and it's a one-on-one thing, I like to do it one-on-one because then there's less pressure and I can ask what I want. I start by doing the thing that everybody does. You look at their resume and I pick something interesting off it. And I say, oh, I see you did this kind of work, like, what was that like? And then, get them talking about that. And, oh, why did you do that? Was that the way it was done? You're just asking a ton of questions about what they did, why they did it. And in that process, personally, I feel that, you get a sense of their values, you get a sense of their motivation, you get a sense of their personality type and their communication style, their level of professionalism. You get a sense of, what their core competency is, and maybe like a breadth of skill set that they have across the board. And personally, I find that like, that's what I would go to. I wouldn't go to formal questions about like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? I would keep it as a very informal thing, because that's when people let down their guard. That's when they're honest and they talk about very individualistic things. So that's what I do. I mean, that's how they do it with executives and stuff. And you really go deep, and it's over multiple sessions and stuff like this. And
Yes.
You get all that information that way. Very inefficient, but I find it's a lot more valuable. It's a lot more honest, and you really get insight.
Yes. Well, and you kind of alluded to this by saying it's not, it's inefficient if we were to do it in that way, which is why I think that there are questions like, tell me about yourself, kind of peppered in through the general interview process, because it's a way to get a little bit more personal and insightful information from the candidate without asking those really structured, rigid questions. And if we were to truly just make hiring decisions based off of who is qualified from the technical standpoint, there's lots of people who could be qualified. So even let's say we have 100 applicants, which many jobs these days are getting way more than 100 applicants, but let's just make it easy. We'll say we have 100 applicants. Let's say 30% of those people are qualified. They meet the minimum and most of the preferred qualifications. That's still 30 people that we'd have to interview. So then how do we make decisions? Well, let's say all 30 people are qualified. We don't have 30 open positions. So now we have to start making subjective decisions based off of who we think is going to be the best fit for the role. And that's where we take into consideration organizational values, goals, the other team members that this person would be working with. Asking those behavior-based questions of how do you handle conflict? Maybe we have really tough clients or customers that we work with, and we need someone who is not conflict averse to jump into this position. And so those types of behaviors are not technical. Those are things that are a little bit harder to train and a little bit harder to learn. And so I think that's where those like interview questions, and it's still feels like somewhat of an assembly line because they're standardized. But interview questions like tell me about yourself gives us some insight into candidates to make a decision of, okay, do they have the technical skills? Yes. Do they also then have more of the personable skills to really fit with this team, this manager, the customers or clients that we're working with, and the organization as a whole?
Yeah.
What's tough about that is that is subjective. And that's where a lot of other problems can come into play, like discrimination, bias, things like that. But that, again, is a whole other conversation. But I think that's why questions like tell me about yourself are included in interviews, is because if we truly were going just on qualifications to do the job, that doesn't give us the whole picture of how this person might do in the role.
Yeah. And the reality is that like that stuff in the real world, people hate this, but it matters more. It matters more than your technical qualifications for most jobs, not all jobs, but for most jobs, that's kind of the reality. Like you could be highly qualified, but you don't get selected. And that's a common, as I'm sure you know, that's a common scenario for a lot of job seekers. They have this sort of natural frustration because it's like, I was like super qualified. I was like, you know, I fit like my qualifications, which are kind of a bit diverse. I've got like, qualifications here. I've got qualifications here, not a combination you normally see, but that's what they were looking for. And I had that to a T, and they didn't select me. Then they told me I wasn't qualified or something, as their reason.
Other qualified candidates.
Yeah, exactly. Um, and people are sort of tied to this idea that, if I'm qualified, they'll hire me. And that's not how it works. In fact, like what you were mentioning, a lot of the soft skills and a lot of the other things, like that's primarily what people look at, and that's what a lot of these questions are designed to probe for, not necessarily your technical skills, but they want to know your communication style. They want to know, do you have the maturity to deal with stress properly in a professional situation, or, things like this. Like, I don't care. You could be a brilliant person with technical skills. Like you could do the technical aspects of your job really well. But if you're insufferable or something, and no one wants to work with you, that's a major, major handicap. And for that reason alone, you would be rejected or something as not a good fit, because that's something that maybe nobody said explicitly. Like that's super important, and you need to have that. So
yeah. Being likable, as awful as it is to put it that way, is really critical to your success professionally.
yes.
I might be great at my job. I might have all the technical skills, but if I alienate all of the people that I'm working with and I can't build rapport with them, then I'm not going to have the ability to collaborate with others. People are not going to want to work with me. It's going to take a really long time for people to trust me and the work that I do. And that those people skills are essential to success in almost any job. And in fact, I'd probably argue every job, because even if you're working by yourself, you're still probably communicating with customers or someone in some way.
Definitely.
And if you don't have those people skills and you can't communicate that during an interview, then they're going to go with someone who maybe has less qualifications, but can learn those technical things on the job.
Yeah, definitely. And, I mean, I don't know who is to blame for this. I think someone should be to blame for it, but I don't know who. I don't know if it's schools or, whatever, but like, a lot of people are ignorant of this. Like they're never told this, they just operate under the natural assumption that, oh, if I'm qualified, I'll get it. And no one's ever told them like, well, in order for you to exist in a job, like you're a member of an organization, you will have to communicate with at least your boss, and most likely other people in some way, shape, or form. You're going to be getting data or material from somewhere for some person, and you're going to be doing something to it, and you're going to be processing it and then passing it on to someone else in some capacity. So you're going to be communicating with somebody over here, you're going to be communicating with somebody over here, and then you've got your boss, and there might be other people that you might have to report to or deal with occasionally. So you can't get away from it. Even if you're in a very technical job, if you're writing code all day by yourself or something, you can't escape it. And even if you're communicating with your boss, if you're the person that really argues back over everything, you might be right in the things that you're saying. You might be technically correct, but maybe you don't see the fact that, like, if the boss had every single one of their direct reports always questioning every single thing the boss told each one of them, and the boss would have to sort of have an argument or a conversation over everything, that's just not practical. That's unworkable.
Yes.
So I it's weird how like students come out of school and they've never been told this, it seems. It just.
Well, and it's even goes into like my long-term career success, because let's say that I'm the person who doesn't know this information and I'm argumentative with my boss, or I'm constantly questioning why they're giving me certain assignments. And then the opportunity for promotion comes up. My boss might say, absolutely not ready for promotion because of those small kind of micro behaviors that I'm engaging in regularly with them. Versus being the person who's a little bit more easygoing. I might, internally cringe when they give me an assignment or critiques the work that I've done, but I kind of adjust as needed. And it can play into our long-term career success easily.
Oh,
Just
definitely. Yeah.
the rapport and relationship we're able to build and maintain with people.
And even like slightly more nefarious things, like you're not as visible as somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever the boss might have, say, 8 direct reports, and you're one of those 8,
Yeah.
and you're maybe the most experienced of the 8, you've been in that position for the longest. So you might also be a bit of a go-to person when when your peers have questions, whenever they come to you and you train them and, informally and all this kind of stuff. But somebody else is maybe a bit more visible from the boss's perspective. You go to the meetings, you're on the conference calls or whatever, medium there is. But your coworker who's junior to you, they're the ones making the suggestions. They're the ones volunteering to do extra work. They're the ones conversing with the boss after the fact, as an optional kind of thing, offering to help or to, offering other ideas or, whatever. So the boss is thinking like, okay, well, if I have to promote somebody, this other person, this junior employee is the one that comes to mind because they're the ones that are they're the one that's most enthusiastic. They're the most helpful. They're the one that's showing the most dedication and offering to do all this extra stuff. So that trumps the quieter employee that's just doing their job in the corner and doing a fantastic job, but they're not as visible. So there's a lot of factors. There's a lot of factors in this stuff. And it's not, at least for younger people, it's not commonly known or taught or, no one ever says this stuff. People are left to learn it the hard way, I guess,
Yeah. Yeah. And it can quickly turn into then toxic culture where it starts to be divisive, where it's like me against you. I suddenly have to like put all like helping you is no longer my interest. My interest is now standing out to my manager so that I can be promoted.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting how all of these different variables can come into play in the employment process. And the same thing is true during the interview process. If I am, just answering the question, but not really engaging personally during the interview process with my, interviewers, whoever that might be, then even though I may be perfectly fit for the role that I'm actually going to be doing the work on a day-to-day basis, if I'm not engaging in some of the niceties, the social niceties, then I might be put at the bottom of the list to move forward.
Yeah, definitely.
So it is tricky.
That's an area I think, well, I'm speaking from experience, like a lot of introverts or technical people, they are they're at a disadvantage, and the disadvantage in a way is of their own making because they devalue a lot of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
No one told them about its importance, but when someone does, or they see evidence of it, they kind of devalue it. Oh, you shouldn't have to do that.
Yes.
And I agree, but in the world, in a practical sense, that's what gets results, and there are very legitimate reasons behind why you need to do that stuff.
Yes.
It's just that you're not maybe seeing it because you're not the boss yet or something like that. So,
Yep. And we have our blinders on, it's kind of what's important to me in the moment and what has impacted me so far. So I might not be able to see all of these other pieces at play simultaneously.
Yeah, exactly. We've got a couple more comments here. Somebody says, I know you have to answer succinct during the interview, but what do you do when you have to provide a complex context I don't fully understand that. Do you understand what they're?
I do. Yes.
Well,
So when we're answering interview questions, I
okay.
think what they're maybe getting at is answering with the STAR method.
Yep.
Many times people are given the advice that when you're going to be answering an interview question, you want to keep it short, succinct, concise, to the point. And sometimes there may be complex context that you need to describe ahead of time to kind of set the stage. I think that complex context, that feels like a tongue twister to me.
It is. Yeah. You're doing a good job. You're doing better than I was.
I feel like it's very subjective. So we really want to think about, okay, the interviewer is asking us a question. What do they really want to know? And so
Yeah.
let's say, tell me about a time that you had to solve this very specific type of problem. Like maybe I'm applying for a sales job or a computer specific job where I'm gonna have to do like a software program development of some sort. And I may feel like I need to describe every single step that I did in that process. We want to think of it from that bigger picture. What results are they looking from us? What are they wanting to know specifically? They may not need to know A through Z process, but they want to know how I got from A to Z. So I can and this still feels vague, so I'm not quite sure if this is fully answering the question that came through, but we want to think, okay, they're asking me this question. I believe that they're wanting to know XYZ. How can I share one of my experiences in a easy to follow way that answers this question in full without going into too many details that are unnecessary? Now, if they are, go ahead.
No. I'm taking it all in. So keep going.
Yeah. So if they're in this industry, they may already know that some of this complex context exists. And so we could even preface it by saying, there's a lot of background to this answer. So if you want me to give additional context, please let me know. And then you can go into your response. I think using the CAR method, which is my preference because it's a little bit shorter of an acronym to remember: context, action, result. That context is probably the shortest part of your answer to any behavior or situation-based question because you're just setting the stage. They don't really care much about the context. They're more interested in what you did and the results you achieved as a result of that.
Makes sense. Yeah.
So hopefully that answered the question. It still felt vague to me. So
Yeah, it goes into, I mean, I know this isn't exactly what you were saying, but it goes into a little bit of like the politician's answer. It's like, don't answer the question you were asked, answer the question you wish you were asked. So you get to say your thing, but it's packaged as a response to that question that they asked. So it doesn't completely ignore it, but it's sort of like, it answers them technically, but it also says the thing you want to say. If you want them to be aware of something, or you want a vehicle to tell them about this accomplishment you had or something like that,
yes,
it can be used for that.
And many questions that come through during the interview process can be predicted. And I've mentioned ChatGPT a couple of times in our conversations, Bill, but I love using ChatGPT to help prepare myself for things. So you can take a job posting, you can paste it into ChatGPT, and you can say, give me 10 behavior or situation-based interview questions based on the job posting below. Give me 10 technical interview questions. And it will generate questions that may or may not be super accurate, but can help you prepare for what could come up. And the reason I recommend doing that is because it will pull out the important themes from the job posting, which you can then work on highlighting and practicing and preparing for prior to your interview.
That's a great tip for how many, does it say how many people are here? No, it doesn't. I thought it said that. Oh, here we go. 19. So there's 19 people watching this. So that's a great tip, by the way. A great use of ChatGPT to help you prepare specifically, not just in a general way, but for an interview for a specific job. Brian L says, as two amazing career and hiring coach, how often you actually see age discrimination when hiring, despite it's illegal on paper? I think that's definitely your area, since you did a video on that recently that everybody should go watch.
Yes. So age discrimination is a huge topic. I would say that it's probably more unconsciously happening than anyone would like to admit. I think that a lot of companies and organizations have things in place to make like justifications as to why it wouldn't be age based. And so I think what I'm trying to say is that it's probably happening a lot more than what we could even document it as. I've worked with a lot of older job seekers, preparing them for interviews, and many times they get rejected from interviews. And it just says that a better fit was, found, or someone who was a better qualified candidate was moved forward in the process. And there's not a lot of room for feedback. And so what I would recommend doing is that if you believe you have experienced age discrimination, I mean, there's a couple of things. If you are worried that you've experienced it, you're pretty sure it's happened, talk to someone who's an expert in that. Find a lawyer who is an employment law expert. And they even drill down into a niche of being even more specific focus on discrimination and age discrimination. So talk to someone who's the professional there. They can give you some tips on things that you can do to actually follow through with that. The other thing that you can do is you can just ask for feedback from the recruiter or the hiring manager who has given you that rejection. Another use for ChatGPT is you can type in your prompt and ask ChatGPT to provide you with a response to this rejection that acknowledges your disappointment, and then ask for their advice. You might then get some response from them rather than feedback specifically. That sometimes triggers people to be a little bit more worried about what that could look like. But if I ask someone for advice on how I could then do better in my next interview, they might give me some feedback on how I can format interview questions and answers to interview questions, my overall application, anything that could help me reduce that initial bias. Ultimately, we don't have control over how other people perceive us and the decisions they make about us, but we can do things on our end to ideally make it less of an impact.
Yeah, it's interesting. I agree with you wholeheartedly that age discrimination is a thing, and it's ubiquitous. It's happening all over the place. I've seen it go both ways. I've seen age discrimination against older people. I've seen age discrimination against younger people, and I've seen them in equal measure. Like, for example, and I'm trying to remember the details of this because it's been many years since I dealt with this, but like, for example, like I'm in Canada, so our labor laws are similar to the United States. They're not the same, but they're similar. And there, I went through a period where, as part of my duties, I had to deal with like workplace health and safety and workers' compensation, all this kind of stuff. And the law in Canada was like, let's say you wanted to hire a welder, okay, somebody who does welding or does some kind of physically demanding job, and so you would get candidates for when you post those positions. Some people would be 25 years old, some people would be 62 years old, and the issue that we had and we still have in Canada, and I believe in the States it's the same problem, is that if you have a 62-year-old welder or someone, and they've been doing welding for 40 years or whatever, they may have developed repetitive stress injuries and things like this. So, like welders, I've worked around welders a lot of my life, and it's like, you have one hand up here holding like a rod and another hand here. So you've been doing this like 12 hours a day or something for like 40 years, and you get weird injuries. And the way it manifests is, you get to a certain age and then all of a sudden, bam, you get like something fails and then you have to go off on disability. Now, that welder has been doing welding for 40 years. You just hired them as a welder 6 months ago. So where did they incur these injuries that accumulate over time? It probably wasn't really working for you. It was working for other people, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you're left holding the bag from a compensation perspective because now they go off on disability and your company has to pay for it, essentially. Like the government covers a lot of it, but you get penalized because you had one of your workers go off on disability on your watch. So this is the problem. Now you want to hire equal opportunity, young people, old people, whatever. But this was a real challenge with hiring older people for that role, because when you look at our accounting, it's like it's costing us a ton of money, right? Whereas opposed to hiring a younger person, they don't tend to go off disability for an injury like a chronic injury where you develop it over time.
Mm-hmm.
So That's one thing that we encountered. And I believe in the States, it's the same issue. They haven't adjusted labor laws so that who should pay the compensation? Should it be your company that hired them 6 months ago? It should be all the companies that employed them, that
Mhm.
maybe got them to work without proper equipment, without proper resources and things like that. That would be a more fair, kind of equitable thing. So the end result of that is that the company doesn't want to hire an older employee for that role. I've also seen it younger, discriminate against younger people, because if you want to, if you, on the one hand you want it to be equal opportunity, on the other hand you value years of experience. So that's a total contradiction right there. How many young people in their 20s are going to have 20 years experience doing something? Zero. So you know what I mean? So until people really resolve some of these hard contradictions, we're going to see official things being done, but we're going to see the problem being pushed underground where
Yep.
it's harder to detect. In that's been my experience. I'm not an expert on all the laws and stuff like you are, but that's been kind of my experience, just kind of seeing what goes on behind the scenes.
Yes. And that's why I think it's so important to have multiple people involved in the hiring process to kind of be
Mm.
the check and balance for that. Because if a comment like that comes up, well, this person's been doing it for 20 years, they're going to have some injuries that are going to come up in the next 5 years. We
Yeah.
don't want to be the ones responsible for that. Well, then we need to have someone in the room who has the confidence and the courage to call that out and say, well, we can't make hiring decisions based off of the unknowns. That hasn't happened yet. We don't know that that's going to happen. And so choosing to hire someone because of the potential for injury is not okay.
Yeah, but it's not an unknown. You have hard data on
Yes.
what you've paid for your labor cost, and you can divide it up by by age group and et cetera, and
Mhm.
you can get pretty hard data, solid data showing you, right?
Yeah.
And the problem is if you have an accountant in the room that's assisting in that hiring decision, that's where it comes back. At least that's been
Totally.
my experience.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
and I think as you were talking, the other thing that was coming up for me was like pregnancy.
there
Well,
you go.
we would want to not hire women because they could have the potential to get pregnant, because we also know that the data when it comes to, people in certain age groups and even different industries, the, rate of women in jobs and things like that. And so I think it's really tricky because we don't want to make hiring choices on those sorts of topics. And it still does impact the bottom line business.
Yeah.
Um,
And I
yeah.
don't pretend to know all the nuances of that. In all honesty, so far up till about now, I've avoided talking about stuff like that
Yeah.
because I'm not a consummate expert on all that, and it's constantly changing. And depending on what region we're talking about, they're implementing different
Mhm.
laws that look at different things and assess it different ways. So I don't want to sort of get in the middle. I'm just sharing some of the actual problems that you want to do. You want to conform to everything, but there's real practical issues like behind the scenes that, at least when I was dealing with them, they really weren't being addressed. So it forces the problem underground. It forces it to be a more subtle thing that's not openly talked about. It might not even be discussed. It might be just within somebody's reasoning as they make their decision. And there's no way to detect it or to know that that was even the basis for a decision. Like, how do you detect that? Right.
Yes. Yes. Well, and I think when it comes to age discrimination, if I'm worried that my age might be impacting someone's choice, then it's going to be up to me to try to nip that as early as possible.
Yeah.
So that doesn't necessarily mean that I have to try to like overly justify my age, but at the same time, I can be really strategic about how I answer questions during the interview process to let them know how my age, whether it's being young or older, will really impact my value that I can bring to the table. So, maybe using your welder example, I work in there. Maybe I'm a 62-year-old welder, and I know that these are some of the things that I could be facing in my future. Well, I can be really intentional about sharing, what I do to keep myself healthy, the safety trainings that I've gone through, in my jobs in the past, and how we really were intentional about equipment that we used, and things like that, to try
Mm.
to demonstrate ahead of time that even though there might be this hard data and these statistics that show in the next 5 years, I could probably experience a significant injury that then would be the organization's responsibility. I've done things in the past to help me ideally not experience that type of injury.
Yeah. Yeah. And traditionally, like I don't know if I should say this, but this is also one of the issues that I've had with the more very rigid sort of hiring process, the official sort of hiring process, where we talked about earlier, where you try and make it as uniform as possible. You ask everyone the same questions. You don't interact differently with any of the candidates. So if one candidate contacts you and wants to have a conversation with you, I know some people feel pressure to like just not respond, and not because it's not fair that because they're not interacting with the other candidates in the same way. So I find that the problem that I have with that is that, because like we were talking about before, my method is to do more of the executive thing where you really get to know the person.
Mhm.
If you're not doing that, your only choice that's left open to you is to make assumptions, is to go on the law of averages, probabilities, make assumptions about people, because that's to interact with them for many, many hours to really get to know them. So that exacerbates the problem to me. We want to get away from, like, we want to judge everyone properly and not judge based on stereotypes and stuff, but yet we're not willing to put in the time to really get to know these individuals. So we're once again just making assumptions about them and judging them based on that. And so that really, to me, underscores the fundamental problem. You're never going to get, in my opinion, truly objective, universal criteria for how to select somebody. Everyone's going to have a different take on it.
Yep.
And this is good news, because if one company said no and they rejected a candidate, the candidate can go somewhere else and they'll think you're brilliant.
Yep.
It's great.
Well, and I think what it comes down to is, if we're truly going to have an objective process, we let computers do it. We let the computers make the decision for us. And we also then could start to cheat the system a little bit, right? I could put something in my resume and my application that isn't true, that then sets me up for failure when I actually join a job. And so really, this whole process, while it might feel broken from a lot of the different perspectives, I think the other thing we as candidates need to remind ourselves is that everyone is probably doing the best they can. We're not intentionally trying to engage in age discrimination. We're not intentionally trying to beat someone down and demoralize them. Everyone truly is trying the best they can when it comes to this process, which is hard to acknowledge and accept when it comes to accepting rejection after rejection.
Yeah, I'd say there's definitely a lot of people definitely that fall into that category. Personally, I've encountered many people that I know are not doing their best. They're really not doing a great job. I don't know what the proportion is. I don't know. I think everyone's experiences are going to be different.
Yeah.
There's definitely some people out there that are doing a fantastic job. I am in awe of their people skills, their emotional intelligence, their ability to assess people. I've met people like certain executives I think I've met, and some people in HR that work as like executive recruiters, like just their ability to size somebody up. And, they've had a conversation with you for about 5 minutes and already they know exactly what type of person you are. They can sense what your background is. They know all you're likely what your flaws are, not based on stereotypes that they were taught, but just from like detecting things that you yourself have done or said, or you hesitated when they brought this up, or it's just absolutely amazing. Some incredible people that have those abilities, and they're very courteous and they're very professional, and they take the trouble to communicate properly with people, which is very hard sometimes when you have a high volume of people you're dealing with, like a lot of people in your space, for sure. So there's definitely some amazing people out there doing. I do know that there are some bad ones too, and
yes,
that's unfortunately. I think there's some bad apples that definitely are making an impression on people out there.
I agree. And, it's unfortunate. And at the same time, we also, taking to more of like a psychological perspective, one of my most favorite books that I actually trained some classes on is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. And one of the concepts that he talks about in his book is the concept of your circle of concern versus your circle of influence. And my circle of concern is things that concern me and impact me, but I don't have any influence over.
Yeah.
My circle of influence are things that concern me and impact me that I do have control over. Other people fall in our circle of concern. What they do, what they say, how they respond to us are nothing that I can control. And so I find that to increase our resilience and our well-being when it comes to our job search specifically, trying to not take things personally, even if someone really is a terrible recruiter or is a terrible hiring manager and refuses to respond to my emails, etc. I can't control them. And if I
Yeah.
focus on that, then that can make me spiral even further down. So I try to, when I'm working with my clients, to say, like, even if this person isn't responding to your emails, even if this person isn't giving you the feedback that you're looking for, you can't control that. So let's move on. We'll kind of let that be. And hopefully you don't have that bad interaction in your next interview process or hiring process that you engage in.
Exactly. Yeah. We have control over ourselves. We don't directly control other people. We can try to influence other people, but at the end of the day, we have no direct control over them. And if someone isn't behaving the way you want them to behave, and we're talking about it primarily in the context of recruitment and job interviews, just the thing is to realize that that's one individual that is encountered. Maybe they've got a chip on their shoulder. Maybe they're biased against you in some way. Maybe they're biased against anyone that has those specific personality traits or that background or, whatever. We all tend to place value on the things that we ourselves have, and we tend to devalue traits and things that we don't ourselves have. I've encountered that. I've encountered that both ways. I'm sure you have too. So the great thing is that if you get rejected by, a recruiter or a hiring manager or whatever, it's very important not to internalize that and say, oh, what they said to me and their actions, they think I'm a non-starter and they told me I'm not qualified. It's very important not to internalize that. That's one person's opinion. You can't control them. You don't know what's going on behind the scenes. There's plenty more fish in the sea. And, you're going to encounter all kinds of different people that have all kinds of value systems and what they think is great, what they think is bad. And this is what I think is really exciting for people. And there's a lot of different ways to get a job too. So at the end of the day, I think people are going to do all right.
Well, and you had mentioned earlier that it's good news that the process is somewhat subjective, because you could be perfectly qualified for two different roles, apply to both of them. One says, we found other better candidates, and the other one says, you are the bee's knees. You're the perfect fit for us. And so that's, that is the good news, is while you might have one bad experience, you'll likely have more positive experiences as you go through the process.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like sales. It's a numbers game. You knock on one person's door and they slam, would you like, and then they slam the door in your face. And you knock on another door, and then the person is like, hey, come on in. And like, wow, let's talk about that. And they end up buying 5, from you or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So that's the great thing. We got some more comments here. Rosalind says, thanks. That's great information. Well, thank you, Rosalind. We're trying our best. Santi says, suggestions for someone who is not confident in English speaking. Would you have any? What are your thoughts on that, Abby?
I think we just have to remind ourselves that we need to go slow and practice. So I would highly recommend, if you don't already do this, that you record yourself answering common interview questions and then watch it back and listen to it and see how it comes through. I would recommend doing something like using your computer and using Zoom or Microsoft Teams or another platform where you can talk to your webcam. And so you have not only the audio data to listen, but also the video, like the image that people are seeing. Because if I can just practice a little bit and remind myself to go slow, then that over time should make it a little bit easier and hopefully more comfortable. I think the other thing for the people that I've worked with who don't feel very confident in their English speaking is you can kind of address the elephant in the room from the very beginning and say something like, hey, and maybe you wouldn't say it this way, this is a little bit more casual, but
you start with what up, and then
what's up, dog?
Yeah, dog. Yeah.
You could say something along the lines of, English is not my first language. It's not my native language. I'm still getting comfortable with it. So please forgive me if I, make any missteps. I'm going to do my best to be as clear and concise as possible during this
That's
process.
a great suggestion. I like that. That's really good.
Yeah.
I'd also, like, for myself, I'd also recommend doing mock interviews. Like if you have a friend or family member, just going approaching them and saying, could you just give me a hand? You pretend to be the job interviewer and you ask me like these questions, or come up with some questions of your own and ask me them, and we're going to do this. It's going to be like a rehearsal for me. And then afterwards, you can, if you feel comfortable, asking them for their feedback, how they think you did, or what you need to work on. Maybe you don't really care about their, if they're your family member or something, you probably can guess their comments at the end. So you don't necessarily have to do that, but it'll make you feel uncomfortable to a degree. It'll make you feel nervous, like it's the real thing, because you're talking to a whole other flesh and blood person in front of you. And so you might know the answers to the questions, but what you're practicing is how to articulate them when the pressure's on and you feel nervous and it feels real.
And I think along those same lines, you can still record yourself. I think
yes.
When I work with people, they really cringe when they think about recording themselves. They don't like listening to their own voice or seeing themselves speak. But that's really how you'll gather the most effective data to hear how you might be coming across to others and see how you're coming across to others.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know if I would advise everyone to do this, but I almost want to give sort of blanket recommendation and say, for everyone, it might be a good thing for you to get used to recording yourself, whether it's hearing your voice or seeing yourself like on a video or something. It might be good to get desensitized to that and not find it awkward or weird, or you watch it and you go, oh my God, I'm such a loser. It might be good, because then it enables you to do like what you're suggesting, and a whole bunch of other things that help you. Like if you're preparing to give a presentation, or to chair a meeting, or public speaking, or any common scenarios that maybe you're not doing a lot now, but maybe later on in your career might be kind of a big thing that you're asked to do. It'll really help you, certainly then and possibly now, just to be desensitized to that and get used to hearing the sound of your own voice and being able to evaluate your own performance when you see it on a recording.
10 out of 10 would recommend that as well.
Okay, good. Yeah. So we got a couple more comments here. Let's, if anyone has any comments, just get in the chat and ask them now. I've got to get rolling soon, so we'll have to wind this down, but let's get to some of these questions here. Okay. Where did I leave off? That was Santi. So Brian L says, thank you. Great real life examples. The two best collaboration of career channels. Wow. Look at that. Look at that, Abby. Give yourself a round of applause.
Bill and I were like, we're going to try this collaboration thing. Not many people in our like niche do this on YouTube. So
yeah, I wonder.
Glad that
I haven't seen YouTubers in our space really do this. Have you seen anyone do this before?
No.
Yeah, it's like we need to get more people. We need to get like a whole bunch of people. Like if we can get like 9 or 10 people on a stream kind of contributing, I think that would be a great thing.
I do too.
Brian says, how is recruiter being graded if a new hire stays 1 year versus 3 years, or if there is such a grading system to begin with? You want to take that one?
My answer to that is, I don't know. It probably is very organization dependent. And I think there's a lot of variables at play when it comes to retention of employees that probably isn't going to be directly related to the recruiter. In my experience with recruiting, we never had a system like that. Our metrics were more based around time to fill positions, not if those positions stayed filled. So I'm going to say, I don't think that there is a grading system like that for recruiters, though some organizations may employ something like that.
Yeah, I agree. I have not seen a grading system that measures that. You could possibly make an argument that might be something that might make sense, but the real world problem is that like you said, Abby, when people decide to stay or leave, it's usually because of their manager, not because of the recruiter that hired possibly the wrong person in the first place that wasn't going to work out. And we see this demonstrated where you get like, I'm sure this is a common scenario. You get several people that were hired and they seem to be doing fine as employees. They're performing okay. and then a new manager comes in to manage that group, and within like 6 months they've all left, all the employees have left.
Yep.
And that is highly correlated with the manager, and it really doesn't have any relation to were they the right people that should have been selected to be given those jobs in the first place. It really comes down to more of how the manager is being evaluated. And even then, I haven't seen a lot of people looking at that formally. It's always been informal. It's always been like used as a weapon. If you want to try and get rid of a manager, they'll bring that out and they'll use it as a reason to let somebody go. But it's not measured. It's not like measured and looked at as a metric, formally for other reasons. It's just touted out when you want an excuse to do something.
Yeah.
So that's some of the issues with that job. Nobody owns the employee and their performance. So tying it to a recruiter or tying it to a manager is very, very hard to do. So I think that's why we're not seeing that done.
Yep, I would agree. And I think you had mentioned like the number one reason people leave their jobs is because of their relationship with their direct manager or supervisor.
Yeah.
And so tying that back to a recruiter's performance metrics would not make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I agree. However, I mean, I would argue that a similar thing, kind of, you could look at teachers in a similar way, where, the teacher is told to teach a curriculum, and, so is the teacher really responsible for the future performance of the students? Yeah, they taught it, but they didn't teach what they decided to teach. They were given it. So, but it can also be used as a crutch because we're not measuring that. It allows some really bad teachers to flourish in that environment. And I'm sure out there's some really bad recruiters that are just hiring maybe inappropriate candidates, and they're not being held accountable for that. So,
which is why it's so important to have these checks and balances in the interview process. We've got to have more decision makers than just one person to all put their input and kind of collaboratively determine who's going to be the best fit for a role.
And I'll be the first to admit there's some pretty damn incompetent managers out there that are doing a terrible job. And that's a lot of the reason why people leave, independent of any decision, any hiring decision.
And even maybe one of the reasons why a position cannot be filled, because no one will be the perfect fit for this specific manager who's trying to fill a position. And as a recruiter, that can be really frustrating because you have some superstar candidates who still can't measure up to what the hiring manager, who might be the final say, truly wants.
I've seen that in executive roles. I haven't seen that in lower roles, but I've seen that in executive roles where the decision makers are usually board members and, other executives, and they are so conservative. They are so afraid of getting the wrong person in there that they're going to put in charge of their baby, like they're going to put this organization in their hands. It's like, it can't be anyone you don't know. It can't be anyone that hasn't done the exact thing before. And it's like, that's what I've seen is that's like unattainable. I mean, even if you've done the similar thing 20 years ago, that was 20 years ago. If you've done it 5 years ago, that was 5 years ago. You know what I'm saying? Like, you'll never be able to find someone that has done the exact thing. It's like they want to eliminate all risk, and it's just not possible. You've got to take a chance on somebody at the end of the day.
You really do.
Someone says, got to try that recording my voice. Yes, that was a very good tip. And the Chat GPT thing was another thing that I personally thought Abby made a suggestion. I thought that was really, really good. I've never thought of that, to be honest. Use OBS software to capture your sound and a webcam image. It is free and easy to use. Yeah, it might be a bit of an overkill, but I suppose you could use OBS for that.
Yep, I agree.
You could then go and start live streaming.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. Show everyone your practice interviews.
There you go. Yeah. I mean, what's the point of rehearsing for a job interview if you're not doing it properly and broadcasting it out to like 1 million people on the internet?
Getting feedback from the billions of people who have access to YouTube.
There we go. And we all know how courteous and professional internet feedback can be.
Yeah. Our keyboard warriors would have lots of good feedback for you.
Interview question. How do you handle bad communication in the company? You know what? Let's take this, and then that'll probably be the last question. Do you want to take a stab at this, Abby?
Yeah, and I'm wondering, maybe you can clarify in the chat, is that a question that you would ask the interviewers, or is this a question that would come to the interviewee, the person who's actually being interviewed for the job? Because I think that it seems to me like it'd be a question you might ask at the end of an interview, like how do you handle bad communication in the company? But I'm not quite sure which direction it's going
Yeah, it's
in.
very general. I mean, the first thing that formed in my head was, are you talking about upward communication with your boss? Are you talking about
Mhm.
downward communication, like, with your subordinates? Are you talking about horizontal communication with your coworkers? Are you like what are we talking about here? You'd have to refine it more to be able to speak intelligently about that.
Yeah, and I see the clarification came through that this person was asked this during an interview,
Okay,
which
as a general thing.
yeah. And so I think that, I mean, it really depends, but you kind of walk through what you would do in this situation. And so I think we're making some assumptions. If I was asked this question from an interviewer during the interview, I would not really know which direction to go, because is it bad communication with the customer or client? Is it bad communication with, my manager, or, with a coworker? What does that look like? And so I would just kind of describe the context. If I got bad communication from a customer, here's how I would handle that. Here's what bad communication means to me. Here's how I would handle it. And be as clear and focused with your answer as possible, so that if it's not what the interviewer was looking for, they can then clarify. Like, oh, great. It's great to hear how you might communicate with a customer. What about with a colleague? What about with your direct supervisor?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's very, very general. I would not be super comfortable with that, just because I didn't know what specifically they're asking about. But if I was asked this question, I would say something along the lines of, well, the first thing in communication is to make sure that you preserve good relationships with people. So if this came from my boss, and knowing a bit about the context, if this was one instruction of 20 they'd issue that day, and it wasn't really that big of a deal, it was a minor thing, I maybe wouldn't take the trouble to go and ask for clarification, because that's not really sustainable for to do for every little tiny thing.
Mhm.
If it was it was like a major point, and it wasn't something that happens 20 times in a day, I would take the trouble to go see if I could meet with my boss in person, just knock on their office door, and just explain, I received this from you. I'm not sure if you mean this or that or something else. Could you please clarify? And hopefully that would solve the problem right there. If it persisted beyond that, I would do the same thing again, and I would try and handle it in person, because that's the most efficient way that gives the best rapport for people. And then if it was something of high importance, afterward, I would formalize it by maybe sending an email saying, as per our conversation today, I'm going to do this, just so that everyone's on the same page and that there are no surprises later. And then that's how I would handle it. And then at the end of the day, I would get the clarification I need. I would preserve a good working relationship with my manager, or whoever the other party was, and hopefully that would resolve the issue.
Yep.
So something along those lines.
Yeah, and I think it also depends on the role that you're interviewing for. Maybe I'm interviewing for a internal marketing and communications team role, and so
Yeah.
it's more of how do you handle bad communication for the whole organization? That would be a completely different response of, I recognize that not everyone communicates in the same way that I prefer to receive communication. So I might send someone an email and get no response from them. So then I might send them a Slack message or a Teams message, or then I might go to their office in person and send a follow-up email, and just try to describe the different methods of communication and how there's miscommunication in almost anything. And
Yes.
so we want to be as clear and concise as possible in the most respectful, professional way.
Yeah, the real challenge, and this is going to be an increasing problem as we put more priority on diversity of skill sets and diversity of personality types, is that there are a lot of different communication styles out there, and not everybody communicates in the same way, or has the same expectations, or provides the same amount of detail, etc. So being able to do this effectively without causing major personal rifts is a problem. The way you go see someone is you go to their office, you kick the door in, you slam your fist down on the desk, and you demand an explanation. It's very simple. That's how you resolve all these issues.
You wipe everything off their desk, and you
Yeah,
shut their laptop, and you demand they give you their full attention.
exactly. And no one's going to fire you, because they're just so afraid of you. They don't know
Mhm.
what you're going to do, that, the problem solves itself. So
Yep.
there we go. There's your answer.
And that seems like
Awesome.
a great place to wrap this up.
That's right. Sensible advice for a happier world. That's right. Listen, Abby, this was great. I really enjoyed doing this. I think this is something we should continue to do in the future. So I'm sure we'll be in communication. If we could set this up like on some kind of regular basis, I think that would be great.
I agree.
And if anyone has any suggestions of if there's a topic you'd like us to cover or a format, that we could maybe use that you think would work most effectively, let us know. You can contact us on our respective channels and share any opinions you might have on that, and we will definitely look at those.
Yes. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I think, some people might watch this kind of after the fact once it gets processed and posted. But just like Bill said, if you have any ideas on topics that you want to hear from both of us, we have different perspectives that tend to have some, at least a little bit of overlap when it comes to themes. Let us know, because we'd like to continue this great collaboration opportunity, like we comment above.
And we're also looking for suggestions for a name for this. So if you got like a really memorable, kick-ass name for that at the same time describes exactly what we do here, if you can do that in like 1 or 2 words, you've managed to get something that does all that. Let us know, because we're looking for something like that would really stick in everyone's mind.
Yes, essentially the answer to tell me about yourself for this collaboration.
There you go. Exactly. Awesome. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Abby. I'm sure we'll do this again sometime soon.
Yes. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, everyone, for watching. See you soon.
Take care.